times in the 60s, to times as challenging as they are today. With the help of the then Minister Al Hendrickson, he became a conscientious objector to the war in Vietnam. He spent the last 40 years publishing the only progressive independent news in the greater Los Angeles Harbor area, Random Length News. There's always a couple spread out on our hallway. Recognized for his critical observations in his at-length column on both local and national affairs. Enough from me. James Preston Allen.
Thank you, Reverend Wilson. I'm honored and privileged to be here today, and I want to thank you for the science lesson. It was a topic I didn't do well with in school. I would also like to thank my family and friends who've shown up today, particularly Supervisor Hahn, as she was quite curious how a devout atheist could be invited to speak at any church without having a lightning strike. Clearly, or perhaps this morning, the Reverend has explained the inclusivity of the diversity of our faith that will give you a greater understanding. When I was first asked to speak here, I knew exactly what I wanted to say. And it was kind of short and to the point. But as the time drew near, that set of bullet points just started to expand. And so I actually had to write this down. Now I'm using my notes to read from, so excuse me if I'm referring to my notes a little bit more than I usually would when I give a speech, but I did have to use my editor's pen to limit this a bit. So if I've left anything out that some of my longtime friends remember, forgive me. But growing up here on the hill, as it has been known, was really quite an ideal young childhood. Back before the church was even built and the hills were not developed, there were wild fields that I and my friends and my dog Buster used to explore all of the secrets of this hill and the canyons, discovering all of its secrets, even to the extent of finding the source of this stream at George F. Canyon. It was also a time in which this church, when it was constructed with this sort of mid-century minimal modernism, had a very interesting religious education in which they took the children on visitations to other churches. And so we got to see what a Jewish synagogue was like, and we got to experience a Catholic Mass. And in one exquisite field trip, we went to the Santa Susana Mountains, where there was this Christian cult. They were vegetarian. They all dressed like Jesus with, long robes and beards and hair and stuff like that. And the founder of their faith martyred himself with dynamite. Now, I always thought that was a curious choice for the parents of the religious education, but it certainly did open our eyes to the breadth of Christianity, This church was also a place, one of the few places on the hill where you could actually have this open intellectual discourse on theology and philosophy and politics and whatnot. And it was led by but a man who used to smoke a pipe in the library. His name was Fred Thompson, I believe. And that's where I learned about Camus, you know, and Sartre and Martin Buber and, you know, theology and existentialism. I mean, things that, you know, I wasn't going to get out of, you know, Rolling Hills High School. It was also the place, this church was also the place where I learned about the rhythm and blues. And the guy who led the band is in the audience today, Lou Manick, and his band of brothers and friends. It was also the place where we learned about folk music and jazz. Those early years of innocence ended abruptly just about a month before I turned 13 in 1963 with the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. It was the end of the innocence of our country, and it was the end of the innocence of my childhood. The very next year, for some unknown reason, or perhaps for all of the aforementioned stuff, with the help of one of the elders of this church, a bunch of friends and I decided to publish the first off-campus newspaper for Rolling Hills High School. Now, at the time, this was like, you know, forbidden territory. There were rules about what students could and could not say on campus. And the thing is that by us printing this, it was like an 8.5 by 14 sheet of paper printed on both sides with the highest technology at the time, a mimeograph machine, on some borrowed paper from the church. We published this first edition. And of course, the administration at the school was shocked and amazed that somebody had the audacity to actually do this. And as I look back on it, I actually have a copy of one of these things. I don't think that my daughter would have been so bold or bodacious to ask about the things, but one of the things that we were demanding was student free speech, which was very popular, you know, going on in Berkeley at the time, and we did have a few choice words about the war in Vietnam, and et cetera, and criticized the administration of the school. We continued doing this between 64 and the time I graduated in 69. And I never got caught. Now, one of the things that would have happened, of course, was I would have been suspended and would have to go to continuation school. But there was one teacher who was smart enough to have figured it out. And he went to the counselor and said, well, you know, who is this kid? And see, this teacher ran the honors social studies program. And he figured out who was doing the newspaper. And even though my grades would never have gotten me into an honors class of anything, he got me into the honors social studies class because he wanted somebody who would actually ask questions and challenge authority, which is what he got. So it was during this time that I decided to stop saying the Pledge of Allegiance. It was during this time, those years, that I became a conscientious objector with the help of a counselor of this church and a minister. It was also the years of the Watts riots, the police riot at the anti-war demonstration at Century City, which some of my friends and I went to. It was the time in which I was exposed to the writing of Henry David Thoreau, And I should mention one other thing, is that it was during this time that when we finally graduated from copier paper to newsprint, that we actually funded the printing of the newspaper with rock and roll concerts in this very sanctuary. And actually, that went on beyond just the time that I was running the newspaper, because afterwards, the people who inherited that project got the church in a lot of trouble with the neighbors because of the decibels. But many years later, I was at the Long Beach airport, and a woman, this is after I started publishing Random Lengths News, and a woman stopped me and says, "You know, aren't you the guy that does that newspaper?" And I said, "Yes." And we sat down and we had a long talk, and only to discover that she had graduated about 5 or 6 years after I had from Rolling Hills High School. And I said, "So what did you do in high school?" And she says, "Oh, well, we had this student newspaper." And I said, "Really?" I said, "So how did that go?" She says, "Well, I got caught and suspended." I said, "Really? Well, you obviously weren't as good as I was, because because I got away with it for 4 years." And she says, "Well, the funny thing is that my parents hired a lawyer, and we went to the ACLU." I said, "Really? And then what happened?" She says, "We won the case. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and that is the case that gave students, high school students, the right of free speech in the schools." So that took my breath away. I said, "Well, you know, God, you never know where your words are going to land or what your actions are going to do far beyond the room in which you say them or write them." So it was during the year 1968, my father decided that because of my interest in politics and government and things, that he was going to send me on a mission with the American Friends Service Committee to the United Nations in Washington, D.C., just to see how government worked. And so it was a bunch of suburban, white kids going off on this trip, crossing, and New York, 39-story tall skyscraper, the United Nations building, the mural of Guernica by Pablo Picasso, the General Assembly, not only that, but at that time, the drinking age for beer in New York was made me eligible to have a legal beer. And then it was off to D.C., and on April 3rd, 1968, we arrived in D.C., and the parents had set up that we were going to have this interracial dance party. So you had all of these suburban white kids and a bunch of inner city black kids, and they were cranking up the music, and we were just trying to figure out how these black kids were dancing, because they did a whole different thing than what we were, used to. And just as the music started kicking up and people started enjoying themselves, the news came on that Martin Luther King had just been assassinated in Memphis. And the parents started to cry, and the men started to shake their heads, look down at the floor, and the kids were just sort of stunned. And that's the saddest dance party that I've ever attended in my entire life. And even though they tried to carry it on, by the time the news came back on, there were riots in the cities of America, and particularly in the neighborhoods around the national capital. And we were hustled back to the hotel room, and we were put on lockdown and ordered not to go out of that hotel under any condition, because they didn't want to lose one of the kids, in the mayhem. So the next morning I woke up, looked out the window, went downstairs and snuck out the side door onto the Capitol Mall, and the smell of tear gas and smoke was still in the air. And to my amazement, the National Guard had set up machine gun nests and barbed wire, and they had all armed with bayonets guarding the Capitol building and the Supreme Court. I took a few pictures with my little Kodak camera. I thought to myself, well, Dad, if you wanted me to see how our government actually worked, I think you got your money's worth. But it has always been that kind of curiosity, the search for the truth, and being aware of where you were at when you're experiencing it, that has kind of led me down the path of my life. Now, during this very same year, about 68, early 69, there was a member of this congregation who came to my parents because there was a family that wanted to move on to the hill. And they couldn't get a loan. And they couldn't get a loan because they were the wrong color. And this was the time during the fair housing, the run for fair housing battle and all of that. And the realtor, who was a member of this church, who put the deal together, asked my parents, and somehow my parents put together some money. You know, maybe they'd done it with some other members of the church. I don't remember exactly how. Loaned them money, and the first black family moved into the peninsula. And did that cause an uproar? Oh, the conservatives on the hill, you know, the John Birch Society, you know, remember them? They attacked my father, who was running for re-election on the PV school board. I think my mother must have been shunned out of every sort of, you know, social organization that wasn't liberal on the hill. But my father won re-election, and my parents won the admiration of this congregation. It took courage and conscience for my parents to do this, which led me to the understanding that you cannot teach either courage or conscience out of a book or with a speech. It can only be taught by example and by leadership. Those are the ways in which people learn about courage. So it is this search for truth and courage and conscience, which is actually the cornerstone of this Unitarian faith. Not what we preach or read, but how we live our lives and how we act towards each other. That is what has motivated me through 40 years of publishing, editing, writing, making art, singing, and living. Acts of courage and conscience in search of the truth that motivated me through my many years of struggle, conflict, and creation. I am reminded that one of the last times that I spoke here, we were yet again on the verge of another war. And even though we think we've come so far and achieved so much, we are still faced with this nation's own core challenges: equality, injustice, freedom. This is once again the challenge of a truly independent free press, one that I hope all of you who read it cherish it, and for all of those who aren't familiar with it, pick it up and read it. For it is courage and conscience that is in search of the truth. It is something that we all look for in life. It is something that I have acted upon. And I thank you for being here today. And I will sing you a song before I leave. Something that, see, there's certain things you can put in editorials, and there's some stuff you just can't. And so this is something that can't be in an editorial. But I have this gift to the Reverend, which is a book of my poetry, which I hope you'll put into the library. And give me a moment and as I come around the corner. So this, is this on? This is a song that I wrote back in 1993. It's called City of Glass, The Lights of Los Angeles. Cast like broken glass on a street of black that runs from the Hollywood sign out to all its stacks. But tonight these broken jewels have erupted into flame. Violence runs through the streets. Everybody knows his name. I was a young boy. Suburbs lay slumber, South Central explosion war. How do you explain it? How do you know? Hey, these just are the parts of the city we don't go. City of glass and your celluloid dreams. Perception is reality, nothing's as it seems. City of glass shattered and the shards cuts the deep. Oh, when injustice is still alive. Hey, nobody sleeps. Well, the polls call this a riot where people ran confused between the evils they all know and the liquor store they all use. Insurrection sale where a bunch of TVs got stole. Or was it something more evil down to the core? City of glass and your celluloid dreams. Perception is reality, nothing's as it seems. City of glass shattered and the shards cuts deep. Where justice is still alive. Hey, nobody sleeps. But down here on the mean streets where the blood and cocaine flow, injustice is a face everybody knows. From the immigrants at sweatshops to the homeless on Skid Row, even the crack house down the street in the ghetto. City of glass and your celluloid dreams. Perception is reality, nothing's as it seems. City of glass shatters and the shards cuts. Justice is still alive. Hey, nobody